She killed once every 3 weeks for 9 straight years, always in daylight, always when her victims felt safest. And by the time anyone tracked her down, she had already eaten more human beings than any recorded animal in history. She killed once every 3 weeks for 9 straight years, always in daylight, always when her victims felt safest. And by the time anyone tracked her down, she had already eaten more human beings than any recorded animal in history. 436 people, gone. Not in a single catastrophe, not in one terrible night, but one at a time, in broad daylight, over the course of nearly a decade, in the forests and hill villages of Nepal and northern India, a woman gathering firewood, a child watching goats, a 16-year-old girl walking a path she had walked her entire life. This is not a myth. This is not folklore exaggerated across generations of campfire retellings. This is documented history, confirmed by a post-mortem examination, verified by the British colonial government of the time, and written about by the man who eventually ended it, in his own words, in his own memoir. This is the true story of the Champawat Tigress, the deadliest man-eating animal ever recorded, and the reluctant hunter who was finally forced to face her. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to understand the world she was born into. The turn of the 20th century in the Himalayan foothills was a landscape being violently rearranged. The British colonial government was clearing forests at a staggering pace, carving out farmland, laying railway lines, hunting big game for sport, and pushing deeper into territory that had belonged to tigers for longer than anyone could remember. Every acre of forest that fell was another acre where a predator's usual prey, the deer, the wild boar, the smaller game tigers were built to hunt, simply vanished. Tigers do not choose to hunt humans. It goes against everything in their nature. A healthy tiger with a healthy jaw and healthy teeth wants nothing to do with us. We are slow, we are loud, we do not taste like what a tiger's body was built to crave. But something happens when a tiger is injured, when it can no longer bring down the game it needs, when starvation closes in from one side, and easy, slow-moving, unarmed human beings wander through the forest on the other. That is when the line breaks. And this particular tigress had one of the most severe versions of that injury ever recorded. She began her killing not in India, but across the border in western Nepal, in a village called Rupal. Nobody knows exactly how many people she killed there before word reached the authorities, but by the time the Nepalese government took the threat seriously, the number was already climbing toward 200. 200 people in a country with limited infrastructure, limited communication, and villages scattered across brutal mountain terrain, gone. Hunters were sent after her. They failed. Every single one of them failed. She was not a clumsy animal driven mad by hunger, blundering into settlements. She was calculating. She learned the smell of a waiting hunter. She learned the sound of village drums used to drive tigers into the open. She learned to strike in daylight when the sun was high and villagers had let their guard down because night hunting brought too many armed men waiting in the dark. The man who eventually hunted her down would later say he never encountered a single case of her killing after sundown. Sit with how disturbing that actually is. This was not an animal skulking in shadow, the way every instinct tells us a predator should behave. This was an animal that had learned daylight was safer for her than darkness was for us. The Nepalese government eventually did something almost unthinkable. They called in the army, soldiers, real military infantry, deployed against a single tiger because a single tiger had become a threat significant enough to warrant a military response, and still, she evaded them. What the army did manage to do was corner her, not capture her, but push her, drive her out of her established hunting ground through a massive coordinated beat, forcing her toward the Sarda River, the natural border between Nepal and India. They did not kill the Champawat Tigress that day. They exported her problem. She crossed that river into the Kumaon region of India, and the killing did not stop. It got worse. In Kumaon, something changed in her behavior, something that still unsettles researchers today. day, she stopped operating like a typical tiger with a fixed home territory. She began ranging enormous distances, in some accounts covering more than 20 miles in a single day, moving between villages in a pattern that made her almost impossible to predict or trap. She had, in effect, rewritten her own behavior to become more efficient at exactly one thing: finding human beings who were alone. And her targets were almost never able-bodied men working in groups. They were women, they were children, the people sent to the forest edges to cut grass for livestock, to gather firewood for the household fire, to fetch water, to collect materials for the day's work. These were not people who had wandered recklessly into danger. These were people doing the most mundane, necessary chores of rural life. Chores their mothers had done, chores their grandmothers had done, on the same paths for generations, without incident. Now those paths had become execution grounds. Imagine watching your daughter walk out to gather firewood and never knowing, with any certainty, if she is coming back. Entire villages ground to a halt. Fields went unplanted because farmers refused to walk to them. Men would not leave their homes, even in broad daylight, because they had heard her roar somewhere in the tree line the night before. An entire way of life, built over centuries, paralyzed by one animal that most people never even saw before she killed them. The British colonial administration offered rewards. Professional hunters arrived, chasing fame and money. Local trackers, experienced with man-eaters, tried their luck. Every one of them went home empty-handed, or did not go home at all. Her territory crept closer and closer to the town of Champawat itself, the place that would eventually lend her its name, a town that by the early 1900s existed under something close to siege. 200 became 300. 300 crept toward 400, a victim, on average, once every 3 weeks. For years, across a landscape too vast and too rugged for any conventional hunting party to control. It was in this atmosphere of exhausted desperation that a name kept surfacing among local officials: Jim Corbett. Not yet the legend he would become, not yet the author whose books would sell over 1 million copies worldwide. Corbett, in 1907, was a 31-year-old railway employee, born and raised in the town of Nainital, right in the heart of the Kumaon hills. He knew better than almost anyone alive. He had grown up hunting these forests as a boy. He understood the terrain, the light, the way sound traveled through the ravines, in a way outside hunters simply could not replicate. He had never hunted a man-eater before. This would be his first, and it would nearly kill him before it made him famous. The deputy commissioner of Nainital approached Corbett directly and asked him to take on the hunt. Corbett agreed, but made one specific request. He did not want to search blindly through hundreds of square miles of forest, hoping to stumble across her trail. He asked instead to be notified the moment she claimed another victim, so he could move while the trail was still fresh, while the blood was still wet enough to follow. He did not have to wait long. Word came that the tigress had killed again, a 16 or 17-year-old girl named Premka Devi in the village of Fungar, close to Champawat itself. When Corbett arrived, he found a village that seemed abandoned in broad daylight, doors shut, streets empty, an entire community too frightened to step outside, even with the sun directly overhead. He located the trail, a smear of blood, leading away from where the girl had last been seen, deeper into the undergrowth. Following a blood trail left by a tiger's victim is one of the most dangerous things a hunter can do, because it means walking directly into the one place the tiger is most likely to still be, guarding a kill it does not want to abandon. Corbett followed it anyway. He found what remained of Premka Devi, confirmation of the horror the villagers had feared. And then, in the dense grass nearby, the tigress made her move. She came at him close, fast, and with lethal intent. Corbett fired twice, hurried shots, more instinct than aim, and the tiger broke off, vanishing back into the forest. He had come within moments of becoming victim number 437. Rattled but alive, Corbett realized darkness was approaching, and that continuing the hunt at night against an animal this dangerous, in terrain this unforgiving, would be suicide. He withdrew to plan a different approach. He needed to force her into the open on his own terms, not stumble into her on hers. The final plan came together only days later, after word reached him of another attack, a killing that finally gave him the fresh trail and the local desperation needed to organize something on a massive scale. Villagers, terrified but out of options, agreed to help. Corbett organized what would become one of the largest tiger beats ever recorded in the region. 298 men, mostly unarmed villagers, forming a human wall across the hillside, tasked with making as much noise as possible, shouting, banging drums, crashing through the undergrowth, to drive the tigress out of whatever cover she had retreated into and push her toward the position where Corbett would be waiting. Picture that scene. Nearly 300 men, many of whom had lost family, neighbors, friends to this exact animal, walking forward in a coordinated line into the same forest that had swallowed so many of their people, armed with little more than sticks and their own voices, trusting that one man on a distant hillside would be able to do what professional hunters and an entire army had failed to do. The noise built, the line advanced. Somewhere ahead of them, in the grass, the tigress began to move, exactly as Corbett had gambled she would, funneled by the human wall toward the ravine where he lay waiting with his rifle. She broke from cover close, terrifyingly close, by some accounts within 20 feet of Corbett's position. He fired. His first shot struck her in the chest and shoulder, and in the chaos of the charge, using a rifle borrowed at the last moment because his own weapon had failed him, he fired again and struck her in the foot, stopping her mid-charge, just paces from where he stood. And then it was over. The reign of terror that had lasted nearly a decade crossed international borders, humiliated a national army, and consumed an estimated 436 human lives, ended in seconds, in tall grass, on a hillside outside a small town in the Himalayan foothills. When the villagers reached the body, their fury poured out. Some accounts describe them demanding the corpse be torn apart, a demand born from years of grief and terror that no single act of vengeance could ever fully satisfy. Corbett would not allow it. Instead, in a detail that captures something almost unbearably human about this story, the women and children of the region asked that the body not be removed right away. They wanted to see her. They wanted to look, with their own eyes, at the thing that had haunted their nightmares for years. Because until they saw her lying still and lifeless, some part of them could not fully believe the terror was truly finished. What the post-mortem revealed explained everything and transformed the entire story from a simple tale of monster and hero into something far sadder and more complicated. The tigress's upper and lower canine teeth on the right side of her mouth were shattered, the upper one broken clean in half, the lower one snapped down to the bone. The damage was old, consistent with a gunshot wound inflicted long before Corbett ever encountered her, likely by a hunter who wounded her and simply walked away, never following up, never finishing what they started. Aside from that injury, she was in strong physical condition, an animal in the prime of her life, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. She had not been driven to man-eating by age, or disease, or desperation in the way people might expect. She had been driven to it by a single act of human carelessness, a wound that made hunting her natural prey agonizing or impossible, leaving her with exactly one alternative food source, slow enough and defenseless enough for a broken jaw to manage. Corbett carried that discovery with him for the rest of his life. He continued hunting man-eaters for decades afterward, credited with ending the reigns of terror of other infamous animals across the region, but the lesson of the Champawat Tigress never left him. In the years that followed, he became one of the loudest voices in India for wildlife conservation, arguing that these animals were not monsters, but victims themselves, twisted by human action into something they were never meant to be. His memoir, published decades later, became an international bestseller, selling well over 1 million copies worldwide, carrying that same message to readers who had never set foot in the Himalayas, that the line between predator and prey, between monster and victim, is thinner and more tragic than we like to admit. His efforts eventually contributed to the creation of India's first national park, later renamed in his honor, a permanent, living memorial, not to the hunt, but to the animals he came to believe deserved protection rather than persecution. And yet none of that undoes the 436 lives recorded in the official count, a number historians widely believe is likely an undercount, given how many remote villages in that era never had their losses formally documented at all. 436 confirmed victims. Mothers who never came home from gathering firewood, children who never made it back from the fields, an entire region held hostage for nearly 10 years by the consequences of one careless, unrecovered gunshot fired at an animal that never should have crossed paths with humanity at all. Today, if you travel to Champawat, you can still find a small cement marker near the Chatar Bridge, unassuming, easy to miss, marking the exact spot where the deadliest killing spree by a single animal in recorded history finally came to an end. Locals still tell the story. Some still call her by the name their ancestors gave her in fear, the demon of Champawat. But perhaps the more haunting truth is the one Corbett spent the rest of his life trying to make people understand. She was not a demon. She was not evil. She was an animal in pain, doing the only thing left available to her to survive, in a world humans had already begun tearing apart, long before she ever took her first human life. The real horror of the Champawat Tigress was never really about claws or teeth at all. It was about what happens when we wound something and simply walk away, and what that wound can grow into when nobody ever comes back to finish what they started.